episode 11 of Raise the Bar with me, your host, Daryl LeBar. In this episode, I actually am joined by Scott Colson. Hello, Scott.
Hello.
Hello. This is kind of my desire for what the Raise the Bar episode was going to be at, more of people showing off stuff that they are doing, stuff that is in the community, and just talking about, the positives and negatives, and giving some feedback, and hopefully we can all learn from it. So that was kind of my idea when I started the whole series, and so here we are. We actually get to see some of that. So Scott, we had some Twitter conversations of some frameworks for XRM related frameworks, or CDS, I guess, related frameworks. If we want to switch over to what marketing is calling it these days. And so you said you were working on something, and you wanted to kind of show what it was. So let's dive into it. What do you got?
All right. So I have been kind of reworking various tools I've been using for, I don't know, almost 8 years, I guess, and trying to repackage them in a way that was more modular.
Okay.
And so one of the things I wanted to do was I started looking at what is a process, not a plugin process, but a process. Right, like if I had to build a process in Azure Function, what would that look like? And I've also been thinking a lot about separations of concerns when writing code. So I've been thinking more about what's a data layer thing versus what's a business logic thing versus what's an orchestrator, right? What's the trigger event, or what's causing these things to occur? Okay. And so I decided I wanted to rewrite a lot of what I had before and make it sort of more modular, and have parts that maybe I would use not in plugins, not even in CDS, and parts I would use in plugins, but have those things all build on each other. And so what I've built over the last, I don't know, month or so is kind of my new library that I'm using for the plugin stuff I work on. And so that's what I thought I'd walk through. And I'm going to focus mostly on the the plugin side of it, not dig into how it would be used in Azure or something like that. So in my framework, there's actually on the CDS side of it, there are I guess 4 major things. And one of them is brand new, and it kind of comes out of our Twitter conversation, and that's kind of a new data access model. That's a meld of kind of the Fluent Query that I had been using, and some of the things that you showed me in your framework. And so I came up with kind of a new syntax, or I guess not new syntax, but just a new framework there that sort of flows in the way I look at data, because my data experience started back in SQL 7. And so I think of things as SQL queries more than I would a fetch or a query expression.
Yep.
And then I've got another thing that kind of uses that and says, well, how do we use that inside of a plugin? And then on top of that, so that would be this SDK up here, and we'll dig into those. And then the next thing would be this instrumented SDK, which is a extension of the plugin model, but brings in telemetry. So talks to application insights, handles a lot of that logging and stuff. And then the fourth thing is just a little utility that I've had to solve the problem 3 times now of, hey, I've got these entities of related things. I've got let's say I've got a contacts, and I've got another entity of aliases. So over time, this person's name has changed several times. And this came up in a project I did for Department of Motor Vehicles. And it's how do you search that, right? How do you quickly search that and get a contact back? Not get a list of contacts and a list of aliases, but get a list of contacts. And so I have built kind of a little tool that I use for those kinds of scenarios. And I'll show you how I'm using that in a little internal app I have, where I have parts, because I have a little side business where I do pinball repair. And so I've got parts, and those parts have different part numbers depending on which manufacturer you're talking about, but they're all the same part. So they're like part aliases, if you will.
Okay.
So I thought I'd just start out with just showing you kind of the data stuff, since that's kind of the brand new thing. And probably the easiest way to see that is by looking at some of the unit tests that are in there. So let me just find a test that's got some.
Okay. While you're doing that, I'll go ahead and point out for anyone watching this, you're making use of shared projects, which is a Visual Studio feature.
Yes.
That is something that I haven't found. It was, if I were to take a guess, I would guess about only 10 to 15% of developers that are in the dynamic space have seen or used. And it was designed really with the idea to be utilized by platform developers for like Android and iPhone, to have one core that you could use in multiple places. But it makes perfect sense in our world where we can't have a DLL that we can reference for a plugin. And it's just a way to put all the shared code together and to share that code in its entirety with that actual project. I'm sorry, and then compile that in together. So for anyone that doesn't know what that weird symbol looks like, those double diamonds together, that is a shared project in Visual Studio. So, all right.
Yeah, and I used those here so that I had the flexibility if I wanted to just say, hey, I'm going to just bring the shared project into my plugin. I could do that. And then I also have, basically for every one of those, I've created a standard library project that I can build in assembly. Because if you're going to use things, well, probably doesn't stand so true in the world of CDS, but I like to have the assembly because sometimes I want it just as a reference when I'm coding, and I don't want to bring in the source code. So that's why it's there. I have to admit, I'm kind of a late convert to the no IO merge in plugins, but I'm kind of on board now. So everything's got a source code, NUIT package, and all that stuff. Okay, let's see if we can find. So this is this is just a simple test that shows some of the syntax of the query. Is that can you see that well enough? Do I need to enlarge it?
Yeah, I can see it well. I would zoom just a little bit for those that are maybe not on 1080p. They're watching it. So cool.
Okay, so I'm using your testing framework. As a way to write tests, so this will look kind of familiar. And so this is an example of the syntax of how this works. And the way I built this is I have a query expression builder, so that when you write this query, so in this case you're doing, to read this, we're going to build a query expression around the account entity. We're going to take these two columns out, and we're doing that through, I think the right term is projection. I'm not sure, but that is the code that I swiped from you that I'm trying to still wrap my head around a little bit. And then we do a left join to contacts, from the primary contact ID on the account to the contact ID on the contact. And then with that left join, we're going to do another inner join to the system user, based, from the owner ID of the contact to the system user ID. And we're going to put an alias on there for owner, and we're going to select the column system user ID. Not that it's a terribly sensical query, but it just demonstrates various layers of how it
into
works.
those different layers and stuff like that. Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So and then you build it, and does that return an actual query expression, or does that return something else?
That returns a query expression. Now the other thing you could do, and I'll just do this as a quick sample and not save it, is you could, instead of using a query expression, I could go var records equal new executable Fluent Query. So this is sort of the other way to use this, or use the same syntax. And I'm just going to copy and paste all of this stuff from here to here. And then here you can do a retrieve, or a retrieve all if you think there's going to be a lot of records, or you can do a select, or not select, a first or or default if you think there's only going to be one record.
Okay, so does that executable Fluent Query then inherit from the query expression builder then, and then you just have
actually they
methods on it, or?
inherit from a class that's below it called the
Okay.
Fluent Query. So that's why the syntax all comes from the Fluent Query.
Yeah. And one you're just building query expressions, so you could do with it what you'd like, and the other you're actually retrieving it.
Because I haven't given it a service to execute against.
Yep.
So.
Okay.
So that's so I'm actually pretty happy with that, because it kind of can be used both ways. It's not, I mean, for super simple queries, it's still a little verbose, because you still have to do, I'm sorry, one thing we're not seeing here. I'll just show you, because I didn't actually put any wheres in here because that's not what the test was supposed to check. So let's do filters. Nested. Okay, so this would be kind of example of the query or the filtering. So what I did is, instead of like add filter, I use where any, and that's basically doing a logical and filter.
Okay.
Right.
And then you have another one for ors then?
Yeah, called where all, which is, or I'm sorry, I got those backwards. Where any is the logical or, where all is the logical.
That makes some more sense. And so I do see you are using early bound entities. Is that generated the early bound generator, or is that something else?
So it's not the early bound generator that is in the XRM toolbox. It is. So what I use is Sparkle.
Okay, cool.
Which I think is using your underlying.
It's supposed to be using underneath of it. Yeah, so there should be a way to generate those. If they're not generated with them, there should be a way to generate it with the field names.
Yeah, I haven't figured out how to do that yet. I don't know if that's a setting that just isn't exposed through there, and I just quite honestly haven't spent a ton of time on it. But I would like that, because obviously this is susceptible to typos, and I have a lot of typos in my life. So
yes.
So I
guess here's a question while we're don't go too far into this. A lot of people that aren't I guess are more familiar with link query would say, why not just use link to CRM? Why go through all this extra effort to make it more SQL-ish when the link to CRM is already pretty SQL-ish? I know my answer, but what's your answer?
Well, my answer is, one, I have been burnt by it before, and I have to admit I was burnt a long time ago. So it's very possible that whatever problems that were there when I did it are better. And although it is pretty SQL-like, I still find it to be kind of a clunky syntax. I don't know, and probably I just haven't done it in a long time.
So when you say burnt by it, you mean that it just didn't work at all?
No, it worked. But there were some times when it didn't seem to work, and I could never figure out why. And so after a while, I just ripped it out and replaced it with query expressions. Yeah. And then, quite honestly, for years, I just wrote query expressions, and it's great, fine, I can write them. It's just that this query would fill up a page in a query expression, right? But if you nested it all out, and so. I just like this because it's more. It's easier to look at and say, "Oh, what does this do?" than it is to read a query expression and say, "Ooh, what does this do?" So that's why. And probably I should give the link queries the link provider another shot, but I just haven't.
Okay. So my feelings are very much the same as yours in that there were so many times when the query compile, it should be good to go, but it would fail because maybe I had something on the wrong side of an equals equation. Like the literal had to be on the right hand side, not the left hand side, or there was lots of issues with that. And then also it was very hard to make it in a separate method and be able to reuse that, if that makes sense, because it's in that context. So you have to create a new entity each time in your select in order to even get that thing out of there. And after a while, I was like, for all these little nuances that you have to learn, I think it's just easier to learn the query expression.
Yeah, and I mean, in all honesty, I think I was playing around with that probably back in 2012, maybe. And that was also when I was finally, decided to put on my big boy pants and move over from Visual Basic to C#. And so there was just a lot going on in my world, like what's going on with this syntax? And so I think I just said
totally, totally, yep. I made the transition from Visual Basic to C#, but that was pretty much, I think, a year out of college. I think it was 2006 or 7, I think, when I made that jump. So, all right. So, sorry to interrupt. Let's keep on going here.
Okay, so that's kind of the way the data syntax works, and then basically within the sort of the next level, which is the plugin framework. This is where I think I've done something that is pretty different than the way most people have attacked this.
Okay.
And that difference is my base plugin has a container in it. So it's kind of hard to see. Let me see if I can make that clear. Okay, I need to zoom back out for a minute so I can find something. Okay. So I have a very simple.
Can you also collapse your package manager console if you're not using that?
Yeah, that's a grand idea. Why don't we?
Yeah. I think that was my number one feedback in one of my episodes. It's like, why is that thing open the whole time? You don't need it. It's like, yeah, you're probably right.
How come I can't get a grab on it? There it is. There we go. So what I wanted to do, and this I actually did, my first iteration of this was maybe a year and a half ago, in kind of the predecessor to this framework, is I wanted to have a mechanism where I could register things when the plugin loads. I can register whatever code or whatever objects I want to use into the container, and then put some smarts in the container to say, hey, do I want this to be registered so that it's basically a singleton, or do I want it to be registered as something that gets recreated every time? But have that ability to put things in the container, and then when the plugin fires, so here's an example. You can see when my plugin loads, I push some objects in the container that I use almost all the time. So I've got a little cache provider. I've got a settings provider that hooks up to the environment variables tables so that I can pull settings out easily. I've got a XML configuration thing, so like I can read an XML data resource and parse it and use that as configuration data. I've got a web request factory, which in essence makes standard web requests, except I'm using a wrapper around a web request that has an interface, so that when I might write my unit tests, I can actually fake the web requests if I want to, so I don't have to go out and talk to the whatever I'm integrating to.
Yeah, I got around that with my plugins, with having a service that I'd put into the service provider in the unit tests.
Right.
And so it would check to see, hey, do I have this interface for making this web requests in my service provider, or I don't? Okay, great. Then I'll just create this new one that was the actual real one. But then for unit test, it would just use the fake one. So
yeah, I guess similar. So I just, in my tests, I just basically go into the container and I say, hey, use this fake instead.
Yep.
So I use this. So this is like my base plugin, and these are the things I use most frequently, and I'll show you kind of how those things work. And then there's a context provider that wraps the execution context and adds some additional features to it that work the way I like to work. Yep. But that's nothing new under the sun there, right? I mean, I think a lot of people have done that. Standard, I think this follows kind of Microsoft's best practice of saying, hey, you should, do something where you you have a base plugin, maybe register your events, and then write an event handler. At least I've seen it in a lot of places. I know I'm not the one that came up with that idea. So, if you come in and well, we'll get into how that works. I'll show you some examples in just a second. But in essence, when the standard execute happens, the service provider comes in, we create all the plumbing that normally has to be created, search for a matching handler that I may have registered, which might make more sense in just a minute. But then this is where I start using the containers. So I say, oh, hey, I need an execution context for a CDS plugin in this case. Great. Build me one of those, and then use that for every one of the handlers that I've written.
All right. So you're getting the factory that actually creates the context with the context.
And so what I like about this model is, if for whatever reason, and I don't know what that reason would be for this particular scenario, but if for whatever reason I need a different implementation of this thing, it's easy to do, because I don't have to change this code. I can just go into my plugin that's inheriting from this thing and say, hey, register my new event handler, and use that instead, right? So if I, for whatever reason, need a different execution context, then I can do that. And so an example of where that has paid a dividend for me is, I told you I have this instrumented version of this thing that knows how to talk to application insights. So if I come in there and I go into my instrumented CDS plugin, it inherits from the CDS plugin, and then it has an additional, interface that has some of the things that are specific to this. But then for telemetry, there's a whole bunch of other things that you need to make it work. And my telemetry solution is based pretty much on the application insight API. But I found I couldn't use it. I couldn't use that API in a plugin because it does some things that don't work in a sandboxed environment. And so I started kind of tearing it apart, trying to figure out how to make it work. And by the time I found the parts where I had to tear it out, there was no elegant way to make a change. So I just decided I would, as kind of an exercise, recreate it, and again, recreate it with some interfaces that I could use in this kind of a model. And one of the reasons I like that now is, if I decide someday I'm working for a client and they say, hey, we really like this idea of telemetry, but we don't want to use applications insight for whatever reason. We have our own internal thing. Well, you could still use a lot of this framework. You would just have to come in and probably implement a different kind of transmitter, which is the thing that actually sends the telemetry off, in this case, to applications insight, right? So it's fairly, it would be fairly easy to redo. Now, the downside is there's a ton of code inside of that, of the original applications insight API. Or I shouldn't say API, SDK is the correct word. And so there's a lot of that in here. And this is still really only a subset of it. But really, as the plugin user, all of this just kind of gets buried. So if I come in over here, I'll show you basically another test as a way to demonstrate. All right. Okay, the zooming is messing me up here.
Yeah, you still have more to go down on the tree view there, I think, to get to an actual class.
There we go. Okay. So I just figured I'd show this because I think this will show most of the things that I would do in a plugin that that uses the plugin model in context. So this is a little test plugin that I just wrote inside of my test. It's based on that instrument CDS plugin. In this case, I'm just setting the instrumentation key for application insight in the code. But obviously that's not how you would normally do this. So think of this really as the default key. The way this thing is set up to work is if you go into the environment variables and you put a variable in there called, I think it's cclc.telemetry key, then that's the key it's going to use. I have turned on a thing to track execution performance, which basically means that every one of those handlers that gets executed, there's a stopwatch function that says, hey, how long did that take? And it writes that performance stuff out.
For the telemetry?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, so how long did it take to run the execution handler, and then it sends the telemetry out to Applications Insight, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. And then this is sort of the basic model, right? So from here on out, you would register an event handler. So this is basically something that runs against any entity, any message on post-op, and it does nothing. And then this do nothing ID is just something that gets written out to telemetry. So if you wanted to have some code thing there, you could write that in. That's really the only purpose of that.
Okay.
So some words that mean something. So this is basically the handler, right? That says, hey, when that thing goes, it calls this do nothing. It passes in execution context. And then this is where we start just doing things. So we can track an event, which is different than a message. So that's a specific kind of telemetry. So this will write an event handler out or demonstrate how that works. This demonstrates how we would track an exception if it was something that we were going to handle. Probably not something you do very often in a plugin, but it just demonstrates how it works. So this actually captures information from the exception and writes out the telemetry. This is just doing standard tracing, and it will write obviously to the plugin trace log, but also out to Applications Insights. And this is an example of using when I talked about the web request.
Yep.
So this is a case where the context uses a different factory here. It has one that creates a web request that knows how to do dependency telemetry. So in this case, I am creating I create a web request that basically goes to this URI, right? So we're just going to make a call out to Google, and then we're going to get the data. And we're not going to do anything with it, but so basically you can do a get, a post, a put. It's just instead of the standard HTTP web request where you pass in the verb, this one exposes the verbs as methods. And then here, just because I wanted to demonstrate, hey, what would happen if we actually had some problem in the plugin and it threw an exception, then that is obviously an unhandled exception, and then part of what the plugin itself does is it makes sure it wraps that nicely in a correct invalid plugin exception. But it also, if we're using telemetry, we'll log that all in and send it to the logger. So if I run,
and a good note on that is, since you're logging something outside of outside of CDS, normally if you had a transaction that was a plugin that's running synchronously as a part of the transaction, you wouldn't get any trace log for it if it got rolled back because it's throwing up, right? Or yeah.
Well, if you were using a local entity, that's true.
Yeah.
I think that the standard plugin trace log doesn't have that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. If
but
you
I
used custom logging. Yeah.
I used to have that problem a lot when I made my own, tracing entity, and it's like, oh, something bad happened, but I don't know what.
Yeah.
So in this case, my test actually, just so I could generate some telemetry, my test actually goes through and it creates the plugin registers, and then I actually execute it 20 times just so I can actually generate some telemetry. Okay. So I will go ahead and run that. And it'll take a little while for those things to percolate through. The way the Application Insight SDK does this is it actually creates a separate worker thread that monitors a queue, and when the queue, either every 15 seconds or when the queue fills up, it transmits. So it doesn't. So it's not sending the telemetry as it's generated. The plugin is basically sending the telemetry, sending it to a sink, and the sink takes care of processing it, and queuing it up, and it just sits there until there's, like I said, either the time goes by, or until the queue gets too full, or until the plugin unloads. Okay. Any three of those events will cause whatever's in the queue to be transmitted, and it's transmitted, and so I kind of like that model. I've seen other implementations where people have done it and they just are making HTTP web requests on the fly to send it in. And I like the model where you just push it off to the side. I think it's less intrusive to the actual process itself. And so that's how I have opted to do it. Okay, so here's some examples. So we can see the server requests have come in, and I have to admit I haven't been inside of here for a long time, so my ability to navigate around here might look a little suspect. But if we look at just the stuff that's come in, we can see kind of response times. Now, this doesn't tell you much because these are all kinds of different plugins doing this. And some of them might have been tests that I paused in the middle of debugging. It's hard to know. But down here, we can see like which messages were we processing. Actually, no, I don't have a filter. So this is all stuff that I did, a while ago before our call, just when I was making sure that things were going to still work.
Yep.
But you can kind of dig into these things. It's kind of interesting. If you dig into the actual samples, you can read. Let's see if this one has. This I quite honestly haven't quite figured out how to use yet. But what I wanted to show is that we capture a lot of information from the plugin itself. So pretty much anything you'd expect, like the message, here's the actual class that was executing, the user ID. We've got so these are probably coming from these are coming from the test. So a lot of those things are going to be empty because I didn't set them up. But but you get the business unit ID, the org ID, pretty much anything that you would want to know, or anything that's available in the context that we can log.
So besides the fact that you would have an App Insights, you can have a lot longer than 8,000 characters in your log. You can have data last longer than right. A couple days. Is there something else besides that you're also getting out of the App Insights?
Well, to me, one of the things you get out of App Insights is you get some longer term actual performance information. Okay. Right? So, and this is why I like the track performance. So if we came in here, to me, what you get that is useful is this. Like this thing understanding, like, hey, is this problematic? Is I know that is taking that long, but it's helpful to see like these things, and then you can see like over time, hey, all these exceptions happened during this one period of time, okay, but they don't happen any other time, so maybe that that isn't necessarily a plugin problem, maybe that was an environment problem, okay. Something like that. The other thing I like is this. I think is kind of cool, and I have to admit it's kind of cool. I don't know how super useful it is, but I think it's interesting when you start talking about, hey, my plugin is talking to other parts of the world, to be able to look at that and say, hey, okay, that's great. So we saw that thing before. It seemed like it was taking a long time to do that client request. Well, I can see that almost 700 milliseconds is this web request. So it's really not my plugin that's taking a ton of time. It's waiting for this response to come back. And I think that kind of information can be useful because maybe that means I want to rethink how this works. Maybe I don't want this to be written this way. Maybe I need to come up with some async method or to do it. Cool. So that's kind of what I've been building.
So here's a question for you. One of the hardest parts that I've had to deal with is how do I share what I have with other people?
Yeah.
And shared projects are great when you are all working in the single repository, but it's not something that that's very easy to do with people that aren't going to be working in your repository. So do you have a plan for how others would access it? Or are they just going to download your shared projects?
Actually, my
shared projects, or
my intent is to deliver everything through source code NuGet packages.
Okay, all right. So you do the same thing that I do.
So what
so
this is an example. This is like a little internal app
that you can test
that I use for my pinball
all that kind of fun stuff. Yep.
And so all of those things, if you see here, they all get downloaded as source code. So a bunch of folders get installed under the plugin.
Cool.
And then what I'm trying to figure out right now is, do I want to track that in source control or not? I'm leaning towards not, just saying, well, the packages are defined in the project. And so
the one issue that I've had with that, because I didn't want to include them in source control either, was that if you didn't put them in source control, if you're getting everything brand new from source control, or from NuGet, and you're brand new to the project, it was only getting it for the first project and not for any of the other projects, because it said it's already been downloaded, it's already been installed.
I have noticed that as well. Like if I were to come in here and delete this folder, there's no mechanism to tell it to just reload the package.
Yeah, so that was one thing that was kind of weird. So one of the ways I get around that is I'll create another shared project that's local to like that instance. And then I'll also create another project in the same exact folder that's an actual normal project that I can use NuGet packages, because you can't install a NuGet package to a shared project. But if I have those two project folders in the same folder, I can use a NuGet to bring it down, and then I can include those files in my shared file.
Oh,
and
sure.
And then all the other projects can utilize that shared project. So the NuGet is only installed to the shared. It's only installed to that fake project, but then it's utilized through that shared project, and then everybody else gets it. So that's kind of one of the ways I've gotten around being able to not have to have that code in lots of different spots in my source control. Because if you have 15 plugins and they all have 15 versions of app packages, and someone accidentally goes through and changes one of them, the code only NuGet installers are really nice. That when you go to install a new version, it'll say, "Hey, you updated this, dummy. Now what do you want to do?" But you don't know off the top of your head, someone managed to change this one file in this one plugin. Like you don't know that until you go to like install a different version. So so one other thing while I got you here, because I haven't really spent much time with Scott's Sparkle framework. Do you know any idea how he generates those entities, or how you go through and do that? Do you run a script for that? How do you do that?
So yeah, I can show you that in this. And I set my projects up a little different than the way he would do it, I think. But so when you first install Sparkle, it's going to install this Sparkle folder, and it installs a whole bunch of bat files. And I usually delete all the bat files that I'm not going to use. Like this is a plugin project, so I'm not going to be managing web resources in my plugin project. I might be doing it in a web resource project, but not.
That makes sense.
Right. So I think he tends to put it up at a higher level in the solution tree, but. And then basically you've got a Sparkle JSON file and a Sparkle JSON file, I said. There we go. And this is where you come in and define, all your stuff, right? So, in this case, these are my entities, my actions, generating enums. And in this case, I am not doing one type per file. In some projects, I tell it to go ahead and break those out into separate files per entity and option set. In this case, I did not, but you set it all up there, and then when you want to do something, and I quite honestly I can't remember which Visual Studio tool gives you this, but there's a tool you can download that basically says, hey, if there's an executable file, it just allows me to execute it. So I just click on that, and it runs, right?
So what is that actual batch file commands?
Oh, here I'll show it. It's so it's really, there's not a lot in here, right? It's all navigating down into a folder. Here, hold on, I'll zoom that up.
All right.
So all this is really doing is it's finding
the Sparkle path.
It's finding where the Sparkle exe is. In somewhere in your solution tree, there's a Sparkle exe. It came down with the NuGet package, right? And this is getting it there, and then it's running it.
Okay.
It's running.
And would there be an early bound folder within that Sparkle folder then? Is that what that line 12 is?
So that I think is just running the early bound command, which is a command that the Sparkle exe knows how to run.
Okay. So I just want to see if there is any of the if there is what I think there is for that that command line.
So I don't. So let me see if we can.
Because if we can find it, then I can tell you, hey, here's how you generate those things, and I can at least give you something positive.
Right.
So
right. I'm trying to remember, where does that?
Yeah, where does that folder sit in?
Core tools.
No, that's the SDK.
Yeah.
Is under maybe the.
Hold on. Let me flip to a different. Let me flip to folder view.
Okay.
Okay. So when it's been a while. So when this gets installed, there's a lot of other stuff in here that I'm not showing. Where is the packages folder? All right, let's do this a slightly different way.
You got two of them open. Yay! Because I believe what should happen is I believe he wrote his own settings that he wanted to use.
Yeah.
And then he maps those to my settings, my POCL files.
Okay.
And then I map those to the actual files that are used by the exe, and everything should kind of work for everybody.
Okay, so I think if we come in here, if we find the Sparkle package in here somewhere, probably down here. Okay.
All right, I got Sparkle in there.
Okay, so I think it's going to be in one of these two folders. Okay, there's the Sparkle exe.
Okay. Yeah, so he must have his own thing entirely and doesn't use any of it. Scott, why did I create all that stuff for you? You're not going to use it. No, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Well, whatever. Can't help you that much.
But well, of course, the XRM Toolbox is pretty nice, but I just kind of like having everything in Visual Studio and easy to get to. The other. So I use Sparkle for like doing the early bound, registering the plugins, and where was I going to go with that?
No, I thought registering the plugins was done via a whole bunch of attributes.
Well, it is, but that's also done through the same Sparkle thing. So like if I came down and so early bound is how it would do the
generation of
data generation. Yeah. If I hit deploy plugins and execute that, then that's what goes through and sends the plugin file up and registers it, and that uses the plugin the various attributes, these CRM registration attributes.
Yeah, which seemed rather tedious when I looked at it.
It is. I have to admit, it's tedious, but man, once you set it up, it's like you just don't have to think about it anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And everyone can look at the code and see exactly what it's registered on. They don't have to go look at the registration for it. Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of tedious. One of these days, I need to make some snippets to make it easier to set them up. I pretty much just copy and paste them and change the GUIDs. But
yeah, cool.
But right. Yeah, so that's that. And then for my projects, I use the is it Adoxio? I never remember how to pronounce them, but I use their PowerShell tools for packaging and unpackaging the solutions. That's something you can download the solutions and unpack them using Sparkle as well. But cool. I've just kind of gotten used to using the other one and prefer it because you can do things like suck data out, push data in, and other things. So.
Okay. So I'm just, as we're kind of wrapping up here, I'm impressed that I'm running into other people that have done a fair amount of work, just like I have in their own little frameworks. And I guess it's nice that I'm not the only person that thought what you get out of the box isn't enough, and there needs to be more.
Yeah.
More around that.
Well, quite honestly, I've kind of been, looking at some of the stuff you've done, following some other folks in the community have given me some inspiration to like, hey, this could be better. And I'm a big fan of, maybe frameworks aren't the right word, but I'm a big fan of writing something once and reusing it. And so, what I've done with a lot of the things I've built is when I start to work on a problem, I say, well, how much of this is the real business problem and how much of this is plumbing? Mm-hmm. And if I can find stuff that I think is plumbing, then I try to move that over into something that I can reuse.
Yeah.
And examples of that in this case are Ninja. This is a good one. So, like making REST calls to me is plumbing. Right? If I need to call a REST API on some other system, that's plumbing stuff. So I've made my own little REST client, and it's based on using data contracts. So I guess I'm one of the few people probably left in the world that is happy to make a data contract. I'd rather do that than write JSON. So I'll make a data contract, out of some C# object and let it figure out how to make JSON, because I make too many typos. So I do that, so like in this case, like this is a very simple thing that calls out and creates an invoice in this Invoice Ninja system. This is a shortcut in my platform that basically says, hey, give me a typed proxy. And this could just be my ignorance, but I couldn't figure out how to make one of these things that has data in it. So I had to make my own thing. So this basically says, create one of those things and pull everything out of the input parameters and stuff them into this proxy. So now I can look at that action request and say, okay, I need my endpoint, or my endpoint ID is one of those things in this action request. I need the invoice ID that came from the action request. And then I do basically do some stuff here, but eventually I just do a REST call, right? So I build
a
REST out.
That Invoice Ninja create invoice request is the custom action.
Yes. Yes. So this is me saying create a custom action. Well, I'm sorry. This is the custom action.
Is that an early bound entity then that's been generated?
Well, it's an early bound
action.
And so this is an early bound action.
Okay.
Right. And so if you look at it, it doesn't, or at least I don't see a way to like make it. I mean, it's great. You can use it. You could use it if you're going to call, like I want to make this action request and send it off. It's super handy for that. Mm-hmm. But it's not super handy to say, I am creating a handler for that action.
Yeah.
And I want it loaded with data. So that's
normally for that, you can just take the input parameters from the context and shove it into that thing, and it works just fine. At least that's the way that I
shove it into it. You mean just by named variables?
No, there's just like an actual input parameter thing for it. I'll have to
because I couldn't figure out. So I actually rolled my own. So basically, that's what this does. It just goes through, and it says, hey, take everything out of the input parameters, and put them in here, because that's all this is. It's just a wrapper around the input parameters anyway.
Yeah, that's I basically the same exact thing. Only I do it on the actual context itself. So on the plugin context, you say, hey, this is a context that's for this particular action. So these are the request and response types. And then it's the context what there's some context dot something gives you the actual context dot request.
Right.
That it gives you all
for some reason I've never gotten into using the context much. I was thinking about that the other day, like, because you can use the context to manage like field changes, right? So like if you do an update, it's only going to send the updated fields, that kind of stuff. Are we talking about the same thing?
You mean the actual target, you mean?
Yeah. No, I'm talking like, so you're talking about the context that comes in the XRM client?
In the actual plugin itself. In the iService provider, you get out the execution context out of it, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. That execution
context. Right. Well, that's got the input parameters in it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all this is. I mean, this is really just wrapping that. This plugin execution context is just a wrapper around the standard context. So I don't know. I might not be doing. I mean, this might be my crutch for not understanding how to do this. But what I wanted to do was say, hey, I know there's a whole bunch of stuff that came into the input parameters for this plugin, because this plugin is running against this action message, right? And I want those input parameters in a easy to use manner. So that's all this is doing, right? So, and then down here, I say now I need to make a REST request to go out and talk to this other service, and so I basically have a little factory. I say, make me a request based on this particular data contract, if you will, looking at that endpoint, and then we execute it and we get a response back. So
makes sense. Okay, so where do people go if they want to take a look at this? What's your why don't you show some URLs here?
Okay, yeah.
Or at least maybe how would they best get started?
Well, probably the easiest way would just be to look me up on GitHub, but I have. Actually, this is a GitHub pages, but if it's basically I've got a bunch of repositories on GitHub, and this one is called Code Libraries. That's the one that has basically the core, the CDS stuff, and the telemetry are all in there.
Okay, cool. So that's something to look like if you wanted to see how someone's implemented some App Insight stuff then, basically.
Yeah.
As well as everything else.
All right.
Cool.
Well, thank you.
Cool. Well, thanks, Scott. Appreciate it. Hopefully, this is something that's interesting to other people, and if there's anybody else with something else they want to show, something they worked on that they think other people should be using, I'd be happy to take a look at it and give any comments on that and that kind of stuff. So, Scott, I appreciate the time. Appreciate you reaching out on Twitter and getting together on this.
All right. Thanks a lot, Daryl.
It's been fun.
Really had
I
a good time.
Yep.
Thanks.
Hey, everyone. Bye.